I enjoy being with you, and I want to thank Pearson and Sherry for scheduling this webinar and allowing me to present information related directly to the oral language acquisition inventory, the second version of my work. And if you have any further questions or you need more information, and I know you'll understand that in the 50-minute time frame that we have here, it's very difficult. I don't work in this manner very often. My work is done in the schools, in tutorials as well as classrooms with kids, where I model the assessment before an audience of teachers and administrators or specialists, and then work deliberately with the students themselves, presenting my assessment and then grouping them for an instructional period where I model the activities that subscribe to oracy instruction. So that's, there's just a little preamble for us, because this will be an imperfect presentation. As I always say, I'm a know-it-some like most of you, and each time I work in the schools with the kids and the teachers and the administrators, I learn a heck of a lot more. So if you'll bear that in mind, and on my website, lancegentile.com, you'll find articles that I've written, you'll find a research base for the work I've done, and other documents that will broaden your interest or broaden your understanding of what we're doing here. The presentation here is directly tied to my assessment that I've spent years researching and developing, working directly in the schools and with kids in the process of creating an instrument that I find to be something that is actually useful in determining students who are least experienced in language, literacy, and learning behavior, and the intervention that is needed to move them along on an upward trajectory. What I know for sure represents this little piece of the pie. What I know that I don't know is represented by that blue piece of the pie. And what I don't know that I don't know, or what I think I know that ain't so, is shaped in that larger red portion. And we're working all the time to delimit that shape and to increase the knowledge that we have regarding the work I do, which is quite complex. There are no easy answers. There's no rabbit that you can pull out of a hat and be able to solve these problems, and there's no silver bullet. So this is where we are. And in the schools today, you'll see that much of what we're doing is preparing these kids for tests. This slide shows the breadth of what we're doing in math and science and reading and writing, but much of what's going on is geared toward testing. It's a problem because tests are typically required by law or school districts. They are administered at the end of a unit, at the end of a semester or a year. They provide a numerical score, statistic, or grade level to compare within and between groups. And what makes this even more, excuse me, what makes this more difficult is the results of these tests are not usually delivered until April or May in the school year, and so they do not help inform instruction other than to identify kids as being low or in the middle or high in their achievement. Assessments, which the OLAI 2 is, the brief assessment providing immediate results that shape instruction. The assessments are usually informally designed. They're administered at shorter intervals to determine what students understand and identify which content or skills need additional information or attention. The language arts shrink or expand to the boundaries of what is measured. Walter Loban, one of the best researchers I've found in the area of language development, said this many years ago. And so what we wind up assessing or what we wind up measuring becomes the focus of the content in the curriculum. The test results provide cognitive and perceptual errors and these three are particularly noteworthy. The first one is anchoring, the next one is availability, and the last one is attribution, and I'll talk about each one of these briefly. Your anchoring relates to what you hear or say based upon the things you already believe or understand. What you see is what you get because of past experience. When you learn to look at things differently, the things you look at may look different. The problem here is that the schools are extremely interested in what you do regarding the test information, the test items that are there that the district has to provide for funding or for elevating teacher position and promotion. It creates a very stressful situation for teachers, and it limits the scope of their perception. The next one is availability, and that refers to the fact that what is most recent in your background or in your experience becomes what we seek to find in the results of these tests. And we grab a hold of these symptoms and then assign a label or a score to that particular individual or group. Attribution is a significant issue because we're drawn to stereotypes frequently and look through a wide lens of stereotypes related to a group or a student and assign the issue or the result to a stereotype. Well, ultimately, we need to ask ourselves, what else could it be? Because these tests do not reveal the breadth that is there. I got started doing all of this based upon my realization after years of work with these kids and these students, these teachers. I got started because I realized that these things that were going on in reading tests and in writing tests were very narrowly defined, and so my challenge to the folks I work with is to expand their perception and eliminate bias, to learn to see and hear, then identify what is going on. And this calls for a sharpened eye and a sharpened ear. Mary Lavelle wrote this poem several years ago, and she said, "Until I learned to call the trees by name, friends and neighbors well remembered, far-flung acquaintances nodded to, the world was only green. Now bug-loud nights have opened wide as careful ear discerns the varied calls of crickets and katydids. What more complexity?" And focus on the word complexity has passed me by because I had never learned to see or hear it. And when we're being pushed or being forced to do things that we know or that we have a feel for not being helpful in the work we're doing, but we have to do those things, this creates a very stressful situation. It narrows the eye and it occludes the ear to what may really be going on there. So learning to see and hear differently is the sine qua non of good assessment. The business of identifying these students' difficulties redound around three, I call them the three elephants in the room, which are language development, which includes phonological awareness, structures, and vocabulary, literacy, which includes the print concepts, and then discourse, either the literary or expository discourse, and then learning behavior. And learning behavior is the one that frequently gets left out of the design. Most teachers are not trained very well to identify negative stress responses and then know anything much about intervening in a way that reverses that negativity and moves these students or the groups that I'm working with toward a more positive, flexible stress response. We'll have more to say about that in a little bit. Systems of assessment affect our perception of how well we are doing and of the relative performance of least experienced students. When we rely only on the results of standardized tests, this is what we emphasize and pay insufficient attention to what may be more important for least experienced students. So we are tempted to make the wrong inferences about what is good teaching. We slap a label on these students, and that eliminates our responsibility or our need to do anything differently. and or to go ahead and diversify instruction. The oral language acquisition inventory, the second revision or the second version of my work, is based on the research I've done relative to phonemic awareness, print concepts, repeated sentences, and at the pre-K3 level, we take a real hard look at story retelling, and I'll talk more about that. But this formed the basis of the cognitive work I've done, and then learning behavior is measured in all four components. So we'll talk about the objective of identifying a kid's negative responses to learning when learning is difficult in a little bit. There are three forms of my assessment, a form A, B, and C, and each one of them establishes a baseline and measures growth over time. So that, especially in those schools where there is a response to intervention program going on, this assessment provides a very good instrument whereby teachers or specialists can work with it to establish a baseline first and then teach according to the ORSI instructional model, and in a short period of time, approximately 2.5 to 3 months, they can use a second form of the assessment to measure what growth has occurred in that 3-month period of time, and then make the adjustment in the teaching program. The grades 4 through 6, the upper grades, have a similar design using phonemic awareness and repeated sentences, but focuses on expository reading and expository writing. And so learning behavior is also measured in all four of these components, and there are three forms of the grades 4 through 6 assessment as well. Growth in literacy. If you do authentic assessment for students who are least experienced in these areas of growth and development, the thing to keep in mind is in the schools, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And the more limited our scope in working with these kids through the assessment, the more limited the curriculum becomes and the narrower our design for interactions. So growth in literacy is dependent on a symphony of three interactions. These are interrelated and should be assessed and taught together: language acquisition, narrative, expository discourse, and learning behavior. First, language acquisition. Now, language acquisition is the foundation of thinking and reading and writing. The foundation of all levels of literacy is language development. Language is the driving force behind literary and academic thought. The less language a student controls, the less access there is to books and interactions between text and teachers. The design here, or the graph here, shows very clearly what happens. In my work, we see this all the time. Those kids that enter school who are least experienced in language development, on a trajectory you can see. Of course, in a scattergram, the dots would be around that thicker line, going on an ascendant trajectory. But for the kids who enter least experienced in language development, we see that at third grade, somewhere between third and fourth grade, all of a sudden, their growth in literacy starts to decline. It doesn't continue to grow at that point, and for obvious reasons. The task in reading and writing becomes more complex. The language becomes more diverse. They start to read academic texts, and the academic texts are filled with new word meanings. They have much more text per page. They have variations created by adding phrases at the beginning or one after the other. There's a variety introduced by changing the order of verbs, and changes in the layout designed to suit the book rather than the language. We see this constantly, that the way these books are put together and the formatting of them does not support the language development of our kids. In fact, oftentimes they interfere with the development of our kids' reading and writing. Many students in the work I've done demonstrate, and this is part and parcel of the research I've done, the overuse of simple sentences or the informal language register and never vary sentence structures in their speech or writing. This is something that we're up against today because our kids are prone to television and prone to using video games, gaming, and movies or CDs, videotapes, whatever. And the idea that they're going to encounter a higher level of language register in their private worlds is really unrealistic. The kids that I work with go home to a family or to friends who do not use a higher level of language register, and so I always say to the teachers, if not with me, with whom? We need to very diligently and intensively begin exposing our kids to a higher form of language in the classroom and not descend to using their language or the language of the playground. The culture of school is a special culture. It has a language, an instructional language that our kids need to acquire in order to participate actively in the instructional design. And so they come to school controlling a social survival or informal register of language, and it would sound something like this. Dad and me went to the store. I wanted candy. My dad didn't. He wouldn't buy none. We went home. I mean, been there, done that, like no candy, no nothing. That's an informal or social survival register of language. Now, when they get to school and they begin to read their books that are provided them, that same paragraph would sound something like this. At midday, as is our custom, Father and I did some shopping at a nearby confectionery. I especially looked forward to today's sojourn because I was hoping he would buy me some candy. But Father had other ideas, and we fled before I could make my wishes known. You can see the complexity that begins to emerge in a literary text and in the use of a literary language register. Then, to make things even more difficult, we begin in the fourth grade to confront academic registers that is even more complex and creates an expository discourse with an abundance of what we call cohesive ties. Those are those little bits of language that tie ideas together, such as prepositions or conjunctions or relative pronouns or adverbial connectors. So the same paragraph written in an academic text might sound something like this. When children accompany parents to the store, they frequently ask to buy candy. Owing to the available evidence, most adults are convinced candy can cause cavities because the higher sugar content combined with bacteria in the mouth attacks tooth enamel. Dentists reinforce this fact, and parents frequently remind their children of what the dentist has told them while rejecting their requests. You can see the challenge that is there for our kids who come with this limited language background or least experienced language development as they approach the more ever-widening task that is there for them in literacy. These kids demonstrate, and all of you will recognize the same issues that confront the kids that you work with. They have trouble finding words. They have difficulty formulating complete sentences. They have a hard time using these cohesive links that I've already mentioned, the prepositions, conjunctions, relative pronouns, and adverbial connectors, to expand sentences. They lack a phonemic awareness of print concepts, higher level vocabulary, sentence structures, and expression. And then they demonstrate negative stress responses to the academic language-based activities, and they provide nothing more than a flat monotonic expression. They have great difficulty telling or retelling a story and reading and writing information-based text. And we'll have more to say about this in just a little bit. Standardized tests provide levels of attained by students in end-of-year tests. And the problem is that typically policymakers and these tests are allergic to complexity. So we use what I've developed as a VAA model, value-added assessment, using a formative criterion referenced evidence-based assessment that can provide results and shape instruction over short intervals of time to demonstrate growth. The students that we're wrestling with who come to this country early on or in later years have tremendous difficulty with the work that is assigned to them because they do not control what I've called the most common syntax. These kids need to be fluent in the use of words and phrases, which would evidence a stage 1 language development, when they can use prepositions and conjunctions in their language acquisition. They're at a stage 2, and stage 3 is the point at which these kids control relative pronouns and adverbial connectors and can then begin to formulate more expanded sentences. Once that grammatical structure is fluent and controlled in the ear and in the voice, they're able to look down at a page of text and begin to analyze it and read it to get meaning. The grammatical structures are augmented by the need to control prosody or sound, whereby the tone of the voice changes meaning, where negatives become all important to understanding what's going on, and those are usually triggered by the tone in the voice. The same with questions. Prosodic structures shift the tone of the voice and reveal a command or an exclamation as well. So you can say the same thing or the same words and yet say 3 different things. For instance, you could say, there's a doctor. You can say, there's a doctor. You can say, there's a doctor. And you have 3 completely different meanings. Well, for kids coming to us who have limited or least experience in language development, whether they speak English at home or not, or whether English is just the target language, picking up the differences in sound in a statement is at the bottom of their being able to interpret and understand what they're reading and writing. Narrative is embedded in literary and expository text. If students cannot tell or retell a story with a high degree of clarity, they will be unable to read subject or content-based text, understand or compose it. Narrative and exposition are 2 wings of the same bird. And our kids are coming out of 3rd grade unable to retell or tell a story with a high degree of clarity, and consequently, they're going to struggle immediately with academic text. And the more they struggle, the less inclined they are to work at it. So one of the things I always say to the teachers, narration is a basic skill. And our kids need to learn to narrate early on so that they can clearly read what is there for them and understand and interpret their content-based text work. Stories are not just what we read to ourselves or our children to put us to sleep, nor are they only what we read in literature classes. Rather, they are the essence of intelligence. To understand intelligence, we must understand stories, their meanings, retellings, and structure. Robert Sternberg at Yale has done a great deal of work in this area, and the assessment that I have takes a hard look at kids' ability to retell a story. And then the story is evaluated by the number of words that the child or the student is able to put back into the retelling, and then the number of story elements. There are 4 story elements that we look at to be inserted into each one of these retellings. Talk a little bit about that momentarily. Sentences, the power of discourse. This business in 4th through 6th grade, sentences need to be linked smoothly for discourse to sound right. These students make little or no use of what are called cohesive ties, the tiny bits of verbal mucilage that bind sentences together. When they talk or write, it sounds as if they are using a list of unconnected sentences. And as you listen to our kids talk, more and more they're embedding stall words in their language, in their discourse. They're filled with words like, you know, oh yeah, wow, and then I like, and so on. And then when they're asked to provide a clear description or understanding of something they've read, they're not able to provide a clear, linked, smooth discourse that then communicates their thought, feelings, and intentions clearly. grades 4 through 6 are challenged in the assessment to talk about 4 information-based pictures and text, clarify points of interest or confusion. And then, depending on the ability, the student reads or listens to the passage while looking at the pictures, and then they respond to 5 intrapersonal and 5 extrapersonal points of inquiry. Intrapersonal inquiry refers to meanings that are embedded in students' background knowledge and their experiences. And then extrapersonal inquiry refers to those ideas or those answers that are embedded in the text itself. Well, for students to continue to grow and develop their thinking and learning in content fields, they need to be able to respond to both those areas of inquiry, not just one. And then this piece is notably deficient in many 4th, 5th, and 6th grade kids. The business of writing a summary of an expository passage while looking at the 4 related pictures in sequence. Teacher explains first that a good summary should contain a main idea, at least 2 significant details, and a conclusion. So few of the kids I work with in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade can actually look at these 4 pictures after reading the passages that are connected to them or having a teacher read to them, but they are absolutely deficient in being able to structure a simple summary that contains the main idea, 2 significant details, and a conclusion. And then we find out what kind of emphasis there has been in the classroom or in the tutorial around these things. You find out that most of the time the students have been confronted with getting ready for a test or preparing themselves for the information that is going to be evaluated. Education, specifically literacy, helps build in cortical systems that help modulate reactivity. And this is the piece of work that is so difficult for all of us in today's world. Motivation becomes a central feature and a central challenge for our teachers because of the narrowness of the curriculum that is there for them in the public schools, but also because of the background of our kids who come to us having nothing but amusement and entertainment as a focus for their learning. And so they develop this self-talk that is driving them away from the challenge of working with the task in school or challenging the teacher. Before we're able to do anything in terms of reversing their difficulties in language and literacy development, they have to first learn to think about and change aversive thoughts and feelings. Eleanor Roosevelt said that we must, in order to gain confidence and strength, we must confront each experience that causes fear in a way that allows us to face it and face it directly. That's the way we get better at doing things, and we must confront those fears or those challenges that allow us then to progress. But without the willingness to change the negative feelings and thoughts that kids have about learning in school, there's nothing going to alter their trajectory in their learning. And so if they're going to stay in school, the first thing they have to do is begin to think about and talk about and feel differently about the work that is there for them. As they work to replace negative thoughts and feelings with those that are positive, gradually they develop more flexible responses when learning is difficult. But first they've got to get rid of these thoughts and these feelings regarding the challenge that is there for them. So learning how to identify with the eye or with the ear, sometimes these verbal responses signal this flexibility or this resistance or this flight. But in this case, with a flexible response, students are saying things like this to themselves: yes, I can, I think I can, I'll try, or ask for help. When you get to those students who are fighting the challenge and becoming resistant to the work or to the teacher, they're saying things to themselves: I'm not doing this, I hate it, you can't make me, this is stupid, I'm no good at it, I ain't no school or schoolboy or schoolgirl. there's a whole element of anti-intellectualism in this country that is dragging our kids into what I've referred to before as a La Brea tar pit. Just take a look at the scroll on any television, and you'll see the kind of low-life behavior that is being held up and being glorified. And so the concept of becoming good in school frequently for a lot of kids and in different cultures is not esteemed, and kids have to fight directly to overcome that kind of a response. And also we have so many of our kids who are finding out early on that if they feign helplessness or they demonstrate that they can't do something, somebody will rescue them. And so they develop a flight response or a running away response to the work. They surrender to the least bit of challenge, and what they're saying to themselves is, I can't do this, I don't know what to do, no one can help me, I'll never be able to do it, there's no use trying. And so the idea that somehow or other, without teaching and directly interfering with this response pattern, the negative response pattern, and being willing to take this on, Calvin Coolidge said, nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Our kids are not persisting in chasing down some of the challenge that is there for them in school. And Coolidge goes on to say, talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful people with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is filled with educated derelicts. Perseverance and determination alone are omnipotent. And somehow we've let all of this slide. The news is full of examples of how getting things easily and the quick fix or shortcuts to overcome difficulty are persistent on the television as well as in the CDs and the gaming that is done. They amuse. The kids that we work with frequently, I call them E-children. If it's not easy, if it's not entertaining, if it's not expedient, then I exit. And so the task for all of us is to show these kids that part of what they're doing in school is learning how to overcome challenges that they would never face in their private lives. School is not a window. I mean, it's not a mirror. It's where the kids are seeing only what they've experienced in their own private world. It's supposed to be a window where they look outside and they say, I'd like to be like him or her, or I'd like to do that. This is something that I have as a goal in my future. But that's not the way the world is working these days. So oracy instruction is my model for developing interactions that make sense with kids and that create the binding between oral language literacy and productive learning behavior through multiple meaningful interactions. These interactions are substantive to changing the way our kids perceive and work at becoming literate. We're born with a brain, but we develop our mind, language, and emotion, mostly through the interactions we have with parents, teachers, and friends. And the environment describes and implants the value of learning to read and write and learning in school. And when our teachers or friends, parents, when the focus is not on this issue of making a positive adjustment to the learning that is there, all of a sudden we find that our teachers and the friends that we have, or even our parents, are not supportive of what has to be done there in school. The teacher's response to these things are just as important as the student's responses. And when teachers are forced or being stressed to do certain things that they feel are not conducive to the development of these kids, they begin to tighten up themselves. And you see the teacher having the same response to challenges that are there for them as the kids do. And I've said many times that if your insides don't match your outside, students will challenge or confront you or instruction or both, quit or retreat from you or instruction or both, become very difficult to reach and teach. Notice the order in which those two words appear, reach and teach. So the focus is not just on teaching, The focus has to be an attempt on the part of the teacher to know who these kids are, to understand where they come from, and then to reach them in ways that allow the students to relax, to feel at home or comfortable with the challenges that are there for them in school. But we get this thing all reversed. I can't tell you the number of kindergarten, first grade, second grades, where I work in the schools in the early going in September. The first days in the classroom, the teachers are already teaching. And I always say to them, especially with my assessment, for instance, we don't want our teachers to be using this assessment until they're at least 3 weeks into the school year, because our kids aren't relaxed with them. They're not comfortable with them yet. They haven't developed a sense of trust with that person. And oral language is developed in a very trusting, a social bond, a warm social bond, and that takes time. It's not like a lot of the testing that goes on. And so getting kids into a position where they're comfortable and they know who you are and you know who they are, this takes several weeks. And so reaching first and then teaching is the sine qua non of effective work with our students. Sorry, this thing jumped backwards on us. See where we are here. Yes. Okay, so we're down into the difference in the value-added assessment compared to the, good Lord. Sorry about that. Okay. So if we had a design for working with our kids every day, and this can happen in the lower grades in a 20 to 30 minute period of time, and in the upper grades, in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, by taking 10 to 15 minutes each day and highlighting one of these 6 features of interaction with our kids, we can change the motivation that our kids have for school. We can help design activities that lead kids to a higher level of language register and literacy, but we have to be steadfast in doing this every day for a certain period of time and intensify the interactions that we have with them along these lines. Number one is to model and highlight, select, and talk about pictures, highlighting modeling, vocabulary, or action. And I use sequence cards to do this. We read something meaningful to students every day and talk about it with them. There's a design I have called critical dialogue, and we want to use that as a means of interacting with these kids, because facts provoke thoughts and feelings provoke questions provoke possible answers, solutions, or applications. And so carrying on a critical dialogue about something that's meaningful to them, and we focus directly on the human condition. We see a lot of emphasis today on math and science, and that's good, but there needs to be also a very intense focus on the human condition in literacy, so that our kids are going away with a sense of right and wrong, a sense of moral responsibility, a sense of being an active participant in the society that we live in. We're not doing enough to introduce our kids to that level of discourse and that level of learning. And you can see that in television, news, every day practically. Students select something interesting to read that they understand and talk about with the teacher or other children every day. And then the teacher models fluency and allows students to practice reading accurately and fluently every day. So I have 25 or 26 different activities in my work in the Oral Language Acquisition Inventory 2 that will allow teachers and specialists to select activities that address the needs that their kids have on a daily basis. Expressive writing is extremely important and ought to go on at least twice each school day or each week, and talking about what they have written in light of what makes you feel afraid, safe, happy, sad, or angry. Why is music, reading, poetry, karate, basketball, or and so on important to you? These things build the interest to write And so many kids in 4th, 5th, and 6th grades who do not have the motivation to write and are afraid to expose themselves on paper, they're threatened to death for doing this, requires a skillful hand and a sharing of the pen between the teacher and the student or students. Model coping skills. The teacher or the specialist needs to model positive body language and self-talk when learning is difficult. We can't simply tell the kids how to do this. This takes a model, an active model, and then they're asked to imitate and repeat. They need to demonstrate simple techniques to help students relax during instruction, taking tests and interactions with others, deep breathing, tensing and loosening the muscles in hands, legs, or arms, and so on. But all of this requires a degree of concentrated effort on the part of the teacher to shift, to smuggle in a time of struggle and stress. We need to smuggle things into the curriculum along the 6 lines that I've earmarked here so that the teacher is beginning to enjoy some of what she or he is doing, the specialist, and then that transfers to the students. So often the teacher or specialist is not enjoying what they're doing. They're not interested in a particular curriculum, and so it transfers to the students. Once we're doing things that interest us, we become an interesting person. And so these 6 things that I've earmarked here provide that kind of entree for kids to hang on to some of what's going on in their classrooms or in their tutorials and find a foothold that will allow them, as I've said many times, to use school to invent their future. The Oracy instructional design is built around 3 direct types of interactions that construct meaning. We practice with our students expanding sentences containing cohesive links to establish comprehension. And I've talked about these before. You'll find all of this in my work, very detailed in terms of not just the theoretical or research-based, but also in terms of the specific activities that create the opportunities for this practice. And the focus is on using whole text instead of isolated vocabulary worksheets. Talk about words and the relationships among them, expanding and refining vocabulary instead of just memorizing isolated word meanings. And so working from the base of meaningful text is the key to creating memory and storage in the brain for the words or the language that is being presented. Decades of research on language development reveal that children can construct what they need to know through meaningful conversations augmented by direct teaching. The second interaction is developing contextualized conversations, talking about what the kids know or the students know, the here and now, with extra linguistic support. We call it kinesics, facial expressions, gestures, intonation, and pitch, reading stories to them or reading passages to them, and creating these extra linguistic support systems so that the kids who are struggling with some of the language get the idea from the visual image of the teacher's face or the hand movements, the body language. Decontextualize a purposeful conversation means talking about abstract concepts or events using literary or content vocabulary to articulate knowledge and ideas in a logical flow or sequence, presenting concepts with little kinesic extra-linguistic support and more precise and complex syntax. This is where our kids need a lot of talking about the text, a lot of interaction with the teacher, and the conversations that help build their understanding, their comprehension. Ultimately, words are the bricks, but these cohesive ties or these cohesive links are the mortar to build language comprehension and higher-level thinking. And until our students control those structures and those links, their ability to interpret language and understand what it is they're reading and writing is very limited. So we take a hard look at all of this from both developing cognitive skills, controlling the language structures and the vocabulary, controlling the foundations of literacy, narrative, and discourse, and then we look also at coping skills, the learning behavior of our kids. They have to learn how to control their impulsivity, develop patience, and then planning. They need to be able to set forth a sequence that will allow them to move from point A to point B to point C, and then demonstrate competence across like I say, a sequence of activity or content. They need to develop an ability to overcome adversity and not just quit as soon as things get a little more difficult. And the teacher needs to find ways to intervene in those kids' helplessness or their sense of discouragement, and provide just the right amount of challenge that will demonstrate their ability to overcome the adversity and then become more competent little by little. And at heart, it's this changing of the negative self-talk. I first started working with all this back in 1978 or 79. I worked with Dr. Warren Weinberg at Children's Hospital in Dallas, Texas, and Warren was the first one to identify depression in elementary kids. Until that time, depression was seen as the focus of the adult community or the older community. And since that time, of course, there's been a real change in our focus with working with these kids, and we see them coming to school very depressed, very negative, having experiences that drive them away from the teacher or drive them away from the work. And it's an absolute challenge for all of us to find ways to create a psychology or a mindset of happiness or a mindset of positive growth. One simple little thing that I do with the teachers is to have them every day write a positive quote or an uplifting quote up on the board and spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about it with the kids. My work in the Oral Language Acquisition 2 has a host of activities, as I've said, that gear teachers toward developing that kind of interaction with the kids. I've said many times, quoting Chester Finn, when you're navigating by the wrong stars, pulling harder on the oars still won't get you to your destination. And then my sense with all of this is once you make the right assessment, you have reasonable expectations and few disappointments. The task is to find the right assessment that will carry you forward and not simply give you a score, a stay-nine, or a level. Testing and retesting students without providing effective intervention and evaluating growth in language literacy and learning behavior can both limit and damage the motivation to learn. Using the results of the OLAI 2 and the ORSI instructional curriculum to change the way we interact with students in the quest to create literate minds and keep them in school can change the outcome for them, their families, and society. But by golly, you know, I grew up at a time when school was just spoon-fed to you. You were expected to memorize. You were expected to do what was there for you directly, literally, by virtue of what the curriculum required. And there was very little emphasis on exploring your own world, exploring your own ideas, or interesting you in growth and change based on what you were doing in school. I remember a poem by Richard Brautigan that I read a long time ago, and he said that in fact the thousands of hours he spent in school were built around waiting. And he said it was waiting for recess, waiting for lunch, waiting to go home. He said my teachers could easily have ridden with Jesse James for all the time they stole from me. Well, we know that most teachers do not have that as a focus in what they're doing, and most of us are not guilty of that poetic message. But by golly, I'm in too many classrooms, too many schools where what's happening now is forcing our teachers, our specialists to adhere to curricula that does not incite the interest or the motivation of our kids. So I hope this has been helpful to you in providing information and an awareness. Obviously, we can't do a lot. I'm not seeing you, you're not seeing me, and so much gets lost behind just a transfer of information. So I'm hoping that there's been some development and some interest in creating more search on your part for that information base that will help you in the work you're doing with your kids. Go to my website if you seek more information about all this, lancegentile.com, and you'll certainly have that opportunity. I appreciate your interest. I'll take a few questions, as Sherry might have, that we can address in the short term.
Hello, Dr. Gentile. Stella Jackson asked, our district requires Tier 2 students to be assessed every 3 weeks. Is that not a possibility with this assessment?
Well, Sherry, this is a great question, and this is why. First of all, I'd have to know what they are using as the test after 3 weeks. All right? I don't know. If it's a standardized test, there's no way they're going to demonstrate any change after 3 weeks. This is why I built and constructed this assessment, because the Oral Language Acquisition 2 focuses specifically on criteria that can be changed through intervention, through positive intervention in the short term. And if it's 3 weeks, you can still show a shift in phonemic awareness. You can show a shift in concepts about print. You can show a shift in story retelling and repeated sentences, showing the development of more expanded and refined sentences. Refinement means vocabulary development. And so after 3 weeks of intense intervention using the ORC instructional model, you can, shaping your instruction according to the results of your baseline, based on the baseline of the first form, you can do some of that. I think it's unrealistic as the dickens to expect teachers to show a growth pattern in a very high level based on 3 weeks of intervention. And anybody that tells us that we can do that is naive or misleading us drastically. But that's my take on it. 3 months, yes. That's why we have 3 forms in my assessment. We can show that in with a baseline from September. We can show in January a shift using Form B, and then in May or June we can show the growth using Form C. But all of this is based directly upon the use of ORC instructional intervention. Again, I apologize because I don't know what the test would be that they're using and indicating.
I'm sorry, they are using the EasyCBM.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't even know what that is. But my take on all of this is, typically, as I said, these kinds of tests are allergic to complexity, and it is complexity that our kids need to get a hold of in order to succeed in the school, in the work that's there for them in school.
Okay, and Rita Tintillo writes, if I understand, there is an instructional component of the OLAI 2, correct?
Yes, and in my original work, Sherry, was done with 2 volumes. I had the Oral Language Acquisition Inventory as 1 volume, and the second volume was the ORC Instructional Guide. Well, in the revision, we made the decision, because of cost for doing this, to put everything under 1 cover. Unfortunately, and the ORC instructional activities are all included in the volume, and they make up Chapter 5 of that entire body of work it shows. And this is what makes the OLAI 2 a unique assessment. It is tied directly to the results of the assessment. The ORC instructional guide is boilerplated to the assessment, so that the results of that assessment lead us into doing the things that we know in all 4 components are going to show a change, a shift in our kids' performance.
Okay, and Miriam Dick writes, where can we find Dr. Gentile's work? Also, do you use results of his measure when writing reports for school districts?
Yes. And, of course, like I say, in the RTI tutorials, our teachers are really being pushed to demonstrate this change, but we show them how to identify the level of language development with a student when they start out. We show them then how to evaluate phonemic awareness and sentence structure, and then in the lower grades, the retelling of a story, and then in the upper grades, the same thing with phonemic awareness and in sentence structure, but then it shifts to expository writing and reading and writing. And so a lot of the schools where I work, they've developed an assessment wall, and they include, along with the standardized test results and these other tests that are being used, they include the results of the OLAI 2 from Form A to Form B to Form C to show growth over time. Now, that's the best I can do in a short period here. But I said earlier, first of all, you can Google me, and you'll find a lot of other articles that I've written, and you can find also on my website, lancegentile.com, materials that I've written as well, articles that I've written and research base for my work.
Rita would also like to know, is there a sample that we can view?
When you say sample, what are we talking about? When I work in the schools, yes, I see what you're saying. I'll show them videotape examples of me working with a child who is at a level 1 in language literacy and learning behavior. I'll show them a video clip of me working with a student whose language development is at a level 2, and so on, and level 3 as well, in order to give the teachers an example of what it is they're looking. I always show them the student who's at a level 3 in language development first, because I say to them all the time, you have to begin with the end in mind. If you don't know what it is we're reaching for, you can't set up an instructional design that is going to carry you forward. You first have to know what it looks like from the standpoint of a student at that particular grade level who is succeeding. And then we can talk about what that student does and is capable of managing in the curriculum that these other kids have to do. But if you don't know what it looks like and can't identify the strengths in that kid, all right, we always start with the deficits. My gosh, I'll work with a group of kids in the schools, and I work with them for 45 minutes, and then we stop, and I'll say, this is all I say to the teachers. What did you see there? And my gosh, they'll talk for 20, 25 minutes and identify nothing but the deficits in the students, never mentioning what they're seeing there that augurs well or predicts a positive outcome for the kids. They don't identify strengths immediately. They're always looking for the hole in the donut. And so in order to provide those kinds of examples, I can't do it in a webinar, but I do that in the school work that I do and the work I do with the kids.
Excellent. Well, we've hit our end time at this point. So I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Gentile.
Thank you, Sherry.
For presenting. It's been excellent as usual.
I appreciate that, and thank you. And I apologize for the brevity of what I'm doing here. It's just a medium that is difficult to translate to action, but it's useful to elevate awareness. And if, like I say, if you have access to the Internet, you can Google me and find articles and information that will help support you in the work you're doing. So thanks for your patience and thanks for your participation in this. I know it's hard just to sit out there and in a cold situation without looking at anybody or me providing any actual examples, but that's what I do when I work as a consultant in the schools. So thanks again.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.